Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week, our good friend, Virginia Delegate Nick Freitas, we're going to talk about all of these politicians that promise that X, Y, and Z will make you safe. Don't believe it. They're going to make you less safe. Check it out. Nick Freitas, it's good to have you back.
It's great to be back.
Yeah, you are a long-term fan of the show, even before this iteration of the show. And I thought we'd do all sorts of things tonight. But the first thing we have to do is perhaps celebrate.
Yes.
Because you just won re-election. And I want to get into that story. But if we're going to celebrate, I feel like we need to drink some bourbon.
That would be the appropriate approach.
And, you know, this is a cast-strength bourbon, Booker's.
Ooh.
This bad boy is 62.9%. So if you're not man enough, put a cube in it.
Just straight good bourbon with
and we
ice.
won't judge. Well, we will judge.
Yeah,
but,
as you should.
Yeah. So tell us what on earth happened. I read headlines that you had a write-in campaign, and as one of the biggest write-in campaigns in Virginia history. Yeah. How on earth did you end up in that situation?
Well, it certainly wasn't by choice. There was paperwork issues where there was two pieces of paperwork that they needed from me as the candidate. There was one piece of paperwork they needed from the party, and at first they claimed they didn't have any of it. Then it turned out that, well, okay, no, they didn't need one of them, and they already had that information, but they didn't get the paperwork from the party. So it's going back and forth. And we said, well, okay, look, you grant everyone extensions when this sort of thing happens as long as you're a qualified candidate. Here's all the paperwork you're saying you're missing. All right, let's move on. And that's what they did for every other candidate that had paperwork issues. But in my case, they decided that I needed to not be on the ballot. I even offered to step down. I said, look, I'll step down, but allow a Republican to be on the ballot. If it can't be me, fine, it can't be me, but allow a Republican to be on the ballot. And they not only did they not allow that, they wouldn't even debate it. So the one Republican, it's one Republican and two Democrats in the State Board of Elections. The one Republican said, all right, I have a motion to consider Delegate Freitas being on the ballot. Died for for lack of a second. He goes, okay, I have a motion to allow any Republican to be on the ballot, provided they get the paperwork. And again, failed to even have a second. So at this point, they didn't even want to have a discussion about it. So we said, all right, look, we think you're doing the wrong thing at this point. So we're going to have to do a write-in. And we had a lot of people tell us there was no way we could pull this off. It was as far as we can see, it was the largest write-in in Virginia history. And not only did we win, we won by 15 points. So in the most elaborate spelling bee in recent Virginia history.
Yeah, even I can't spell Freitas. I mean,
no, I have trouble with it.
You probably should have changed your name for political purposes. But anyway, cheers to that.
Cheers.
So I just got back from Louisville, Kentucky. And I have a new discovered. I'd had Booker's before, but I'm sort of into it. I find that moderation and taste is not one of my traits, and that's true with my philosophy, and it's certainly true with my bourbon. So I like this guy because he's a monster.
Well, you know what they say: moderation in everything, to include moderation.
Yes,
that is good.
So there's probably some sort of playbook that you guys should write, and I should point out that your this will be your third term coming up?
Yeah.
Third term in the state House of Delegates in Virginia. Former Green Beret, general constitutional lunatic.
Absolutely.
Is that on your resume?
I love it. I actually have it right on my business card.
Yeah.
Like constitutional lunatic, huge fan of individual liberty. Leave me alone. That's all right there. Yeah.
And you have been representing Young Americans for Liberty. We had Cliff Maloney on the show a couple months ago, and you took a leave of absence to run for re-election because, as I understand it, y'all was knocking on lots of doors during that write-in campaign.
Oh, well, y'all's whole win-at-the-door campaign has really been incredible. I mean, the reason why I put so much time into that particular organization is because of all the things that they've put together. It's not one component, right? It's not just the win at the door. It's not just the education. It's not just the campus. It's bringing all of those things together where I feel like we have a liberty-based organization where they're not only educating the youth, but they're actually helping candidates. And then once candidates get in, they're holding them accountable, and they're providing them with resources that, a lot of liberty-minded legislators wouldn't otherwise have.
Yeah. Yeah, like the entire history of liberty candidates. And I won't exclude either libertarians or Republicans or even Democrats. I'm less interested in party these days, but liberty candidates have always been really smart at book stuff. Like they could quote Mises, and they could explain the non-aggression principle, but in terms of the actual mechanics it would take to win for public office, so I think y'all bringing that to the table is super potent. And you're one of the examples of how that works.
I don't think, we had a lot of great volunteers. Our local committees did an excellent job. All the people that worked at the polls. But I can honestly say I don't think I'm sitting here ready to go into my third term in the General Assembly if YAL had not come in and did what they did. Knocking 30,000 doors is a huge deal in a district of 80,000 people.
So let's take a step back, because you enlisted after 9/11. How old were you?
I enlisted before.
Okay.
Yeah,
So tell us why you enlisted and when you enlisted. You were just a pup.
Yeah. So I actually enlisted when I was 17 years old.
Wow.
I was still in high school, so I enlisted in the National Guard first, and then went on the delayed entry program because I knew I wanted to go active duty. I knew I wanted to be an infantryman. And that's kind of funny, by the way, when you walk into a recruiter's office and you tell them, like, look, I'm going to lay down the law here, right? I'm going to graduate. I've never been in trouble with the law, but if you can't give me the infantry, I'm not signing any papers, right? The recruiter's looking at me like, oh, wow, the infantry. Well, we'll see what we can do. But that's what I want to do. I figure if I'm going to be in the military, I want to be that guy on the ground doing the job in the mud. Enlisted, went active duty. Like 2 weeks out of high school, I was down at beautiful Fort Benning, Georgia for infantry basic training. Yeah.
And 2 terms of duty later?
Yeah, so I started off with the 82nd Airborne Division, 25th Infantry over in Hawaii. That was pretty good duty.
Yeah.
But then 9/11 took place when I was over in Hawaii, and my wife, Tina, and I talked about it, and I pretty much let her know. At the same time, I'm watching Army Special Forces over in Afghanistan on horseback, leading armies and doing phenomenal things. And I said, well, I want to do that. I want to be one of those guys. And the thing that really impressed me about it was not just that they were out there getting to do really cool things, but their whole approach to combat was creating host nation capacity. It was the idea that we're going to come alongside the local population and we're going to fight with them. And so I actually thought it was an approach to combat, an approach to foreign policy that was far more in keeping with some of my political philosophy as well, that if we're going to fight, then let's not try to take over the war and tell everyone how to, what to do and how to do it. Let's come alongside people within that country that have shared interests and cooperate with one another in order to achieve a sustainable solution. Now, obviously, things haven't really worked out that great. And I think in part that's because we do rely a little bit too much on, not overwhelming force, but U.S. domination of a war effort that really should have belonged in large part to the people over there that were fighting it, because they're the ones that are going to have to rebuild after we're gone.
Yeah, like one of the we always quote Hayek on this show. I can't help myself, and there is in fact a drinking game that goes along with watching this show. That every time I quote Hayek, someone has to drink. But there does seem to be that sort of Hayekian. What Hayek criticized is the arrogance of thinking that you were smart enough to redesign a complex society from the top down, and nation building seems like the ultimate Hayekian fatal conceit. Because I can't imagine, because you were embedded and you were actually trying to listen and learn as much as dictate how things would be. But that's not what our foreign policy does. We have very strong opinions, and we don't really give a damn what the facts of the case are.
Well, I got in trouble once because we're about to come back from, I think I've told you this story before. We're coming back from Iraq on my second tour. Last week, we had packed the bags. We were literally, all we were doing was waiting around for the next ODA to come in. And my detachment commander comes over and goes, Nick, you need to put more into the sit rep on the intel portion. I'm like, we literally have not done anything. I mean, I'm reading some reports. It's going to be fluff. He goes, I don't care. Put it in there. So my commander and I had this little game we played. I played it. Sometimes he participated, where I would put something in the sit rep because he's supposed to read them before they go up. I'd put something in there as kind of a joke, and then he'd take it out. Haha, that's really funny, Nick. And then send it up. Well, this time he forgot to. And so I had wrote into our official team sit rep for Special Operations Task Force North. I said, hey, I've got a question for everyone up there that's smarter than me. Why are we the only military from a constitutional republic with a free market economy that goes overseas, overthrows violent dictatorships, and then implements centrally planned economies with parliamentarian democracies? And thankfully, my battalion commander was a very understanding guy.
So that wasn't the last day of your military career?
No, I managed to survive a little bit past that, but no, it was fascinating. One other story, if I could, on this one, because it was interesting. Because I spent so much time working with the indigenous population, the Iraqi military, there was one time where I was sitting there in every village we went to. The question was the same. We need more power. We need power. We don't have generators. So I'm sitting there with this Iraqi colonel, and I said, Sadie, I have a question. Everywhere we go, they ask for power. How come some enterprising young Iraqi entrepreneur isn't going around selling generators or providing power? And he goes, well, Nick, you don't understand. In Iraq, we have certain regulations on the size of the generators we can bring in. I said, okay, government regulation. That makes sense that would stunt growth. But okay, so why don't you buy smaller generators? He goes, oh, well, Nick, you don't understand. We're very family oriented and very, we have our various tribes. And if my cousin can't pay his power bill, then I'm not gonna shut off his power. I said, okay, well then why don't you sell power to someone that's not in your tribe? And finally, he's being very polite, but he's a little bit exacerbating. He goes, why would we do it when you give it to us for free?
Yeah.
And I said, yes, that is the answer. We are over here creating perpetual dependency. So
sounds like our entire experiment with the war on poverty.
Yeah. We've created a lot of poverty in the war on poverty. I don't think that was the intention, but we've certainly
Those unintended consequences are killer.
But we have a huge industry around alleviating poverty that is certainly well funded. So.
Yeah. So speaking of unintended consequences, I didn't intend for that segue, but it's beautiful for where I want to go. And I want to establish the fact that you have spent your adult life defending this country, and presumably in your mind, you're doing it to make America a safer place to live, to protect our citizens. But I have this theory that I want to put in front of you, that every time a politician says, I have policy X, and it's to make you safe, you should run for the hills because it's going to do the opposite.
It's probably a good idea. I was in a debate recently with my previous opponent, and I said, I hear people on the left, and I take them at their word, and really politicians in general. It's not just on the left, but politicians in general talk about I care, and I believe them. But more and more when I look at their policies, what I actually see is I want to control.
Yeah.
And there's a certain element of that where it's overbearing and quite frankly obnoxious.
Yeah.
I wanted the country I believed I'm fighting for was a free one where people get to make their own decisions. But no, another perfect example, and again, unfortunately, we're going to have to segue back to Iraq here for a second. When we first went over to Iraq, we were actually disarming the population. 4 years later, we were arming them. Because guess what? We couldn't be in every village. We couldn't protect every area. And it's the same concept. Over here in the United States, every time a politician says we need a new regulation or we need this new tax because it's going to fund this program that's going to take care of you or it's going to protect you. And you see the same thing with gun control policy is trust us with a little bit more. We just need a little bit more of your freedom, a little bit more of your money, and we'll protect you. Don't worry. And I'm sorry, but I don't see that playing out in society very well. As I look across space and time, as I look across history, I see more and more when populations, when free people give up more of their power to be able to live their own lives, to include to be able to defend themselves, under the hope or promise or guise that the government's going to do it for them, I don't see them being safer. I don't see them being more prosperous. I see them becoming more dependent and later on down the road really regretting it.
Yeah. Well, let's dig into gun control, because I think this is a difficult one for those of us that believe in the Second Amendment, because we always run headlong into arguments about safety.
Yeah.
And they tend to be emotional arguments. And every time there's a horrific shooting, particularly at schools, and people have this emotional response. We have to stop this. And the only way I can think to stop it is to ban this gun or impose more restrictions on the ability of people to acquire guns legally. And logically and empirically, these solutions don't make any sense at all. And yet, emotionally, apparently, they're quite compelling.
Well, and I think you hit it. So one of the things, I used to teach economics and government to students, and one of the things I used to emphasize to them is emotion is not a bad thing. When you have a visceral emotional response to something, whether it be good or bad, that's an invitation to thought. So the moment you allow the emotion to direct your action, that's where you start to get into problems. And that's the part where I start to question, is your true intention to understand this problem and to come up with a solution that will actually work? Or is your true intention to make yourself feel better about whatever the problem is and your response to it? And you see this all the time with kind of the virtue signaling and whatnot. Like, oh, I need to be the first one on Twitter to respond to this.
Yeah.
I don't need to see any other facts. I don't need to see other evidence. In fact, evidence and facts at this point, like, how can you be talking about, cold hard facts when we demand action? Like, well, wait a second. I want to fix the problem. I'm assuming you also want to fix the problem based off of the emotional reaction you've had to it. But what that requires is that now that we have to actually do the hard work of understanding the nature of the problem, the circumstances surrounding it, how to best address it. And if it's just, this will make me feel better, well, then I'm going to start to assume that you're not a compassionate person, you're lazy.
Yeah.
And you just want to do what makes you feel better instead of what actually makes people safer.
Or sort of outsourcing that responsibility, because the other dynamic in play there is there are plenty of politicians that let's be honest, aren't trying to solve the problem, but if they could sort of accumulate political power, and maybe power over our lives in the process, and we bang our heads against the wall and we point out the fact that there's a reason why protesters in Hong Kong are exposed right now.
Yeah.
And some young kid got shot in the abdomen a couple days ago, and there's a history of this authoritarian Chinese government slaughtering people. They did it in Tiananmen Square. Certainly before that, in Mao's China, gun control was a thing, and it wasn't sold as a way to strip people of their ability to defend themselves.
Yeah.
It was sold as, we'll make you safer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same thing. Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. He was worried about the violence, much of which he was orchestrating through the I think they're called captivos. I might be butchering that, but there's these gangs that Maduro was using to sort of impose discipline on protesters in Venezuela, and so they gathered up all the guns, and it was a name of protecting people. Those arguments aren't quite that persuasive, but I do feel like there's two groups. There's the demagogues that want to manipulate you into doing something that you really don't intend, versus people that have an emotional reaction and they do want to solve the problem. We just gotta figure out some sort of way to connect with people who have that visceral idea that we should just take the guns.
No, I agree. I think one of the things I try to focus on whenever we talk about gun control is again, keeping focused on what the problem is. Because most people can agree on a problem and they can agree on a potential end state. They just debate on how we get from problem to end state. And if you can keep the discussion there, you can usually make some progress. Even if you don't, everyone's not singing Kumbaya at the end, you at least can have a respectful conversation. One of the things I always like to bring up with people is, do you realize that conservative estimates suggest that 500,000 times a year in this country, that's conservative estimates, the more liberal ones, 2.1 million per year, Somebody uses a firearm, a law-abiding citizen uses a firearm in order to defend themselves. So when you say we're going to make it harder for someone to have a firearm, you look at the 33,000 gun deaths every year in the United States, 2/3 of which are by suicide, and you say, we're going to prevent some of this. I see 500,000 new victims that never had to be a victim except that their government made them more vulnerable to their attacker.
Yeah.
So if you can appreciate that we both care about innocent people getting harmed and we both want to prevent that, we simply have different approaches to it, well, then we can have a respectful discussion about that. But I'm not about to tell a battered wife that she's not allowed to get a firearm in order to defend herself because it would make you kind of feel safer if she didn't have it. I'm not about to tell the shop owner that has been robbed several times and has been beaten, or as my story my father once relayed me in LAPD of a older gentleman who every month during payday the gang members came over, beat him up, and took his paycheck. I'm not about to tell that person that, hey, you don't get to defend yourself because it might make someone over here feel safer. I'm not interested as much in what makes you feel safe. I'm actually interested in what makes you actually safe.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's difficult, but you're right. We can't just rely on, this isn't just a statistics game. This really is about protecting flesh and blood people and figuring out the best way to do that. And I don't see how disarming law-abiding citizens is the way to do it. And I just want to bring up one other point, because you're right when we say that, well, the Second Amendment is not just about individual defense from a criminal or a gang member. It's about defense from an oppressive government. And you say that today in the United States, and people kind of roll their eyes like, oh,
Right.
you really think the 82nd Airborne Division is coming in? And I like to remind them that, okay, well, 2 generations ago, if you were a black family in the Jim Crow South and you called the cops because the Klan was threatening you, you didn't know if the cops were going to ignore you or if the cops were going to show up and help the Klan.
Yeah.
The thing that actually protected you and your family against the government was the fact that you had the ability to own a firearm and protect yourself, and that you could pool with other people and protect yourselves and protect each other's families. So that wasn't 200 years ago, 50. This isn't redcoats.
Right.
Right. This is, agents of the government in the Jim Crow South a couple generations ago. So this idea that, well, we've moved past all of this, I'm sorry. Human behavior can definitely change and societal norms can change. And I think it's great that I think we have made a lot of progress on civil rights and civil liberties. But don't ever doubt that there is an element of human nature that is always there waiting beneath the surface when it's not held in check. And to say that I'm not going to permit you as the government to be able to defend yourself because I think we're past all of that, that's unjust.
Yeah. As my buddy Maj Touré, I don't know if you've met Maj.
Oh, yeah. I haven't met him, but know of him.
He's founder of Black Guns Matter.
Yeah.
And as he points out, all gun control is racist. And certainly the ugly history of gun control laws in this country have everything to do with the story you just told. And
yeah.
It was a way of disarming black people from defending themselves against not just the Klan, but corrupt cops as well.
Yeah.
And to me, it is a civil rights issue. But it's also a practical issue. Like Terry and I, we live in the District of Columbia. There's plenty of crime here, and we went for the longest time without owning a firearm in our home. Yeah. And of course the district makes it very difficult for citizens to acquire self-defense, but there's been Supreme Court cases that made it easier for us, so we finally did it. But it wasn't about crime. We weren't worried about crime in the city, even though we have plenty of it here. Yeah. What triggered me was the terrorist attack in Paris, where these terrorists took over a concert theater in the Bataclan and gunned everybody down. And reading the interview with the lead singer from the Eagles of Death Metal who were playing that night, he happens to be a Second Amendment guy.
Yeah.
And he will never get over the fact that people didn't know the first basics about how to defend themselves. Yeah. And there was no way to call in the cops. There was no way to call in the military. It was happening at that moment, at that time. So we decided that in a decentralized world where there might be a terrorist attack, certainly in this city, we need to take a little bit of responsibility. Like I think owning a gun is a responsibility, and taking a little bit of responsibility to not just defend your home, but your neighborhood and your community. That's sort of the American system, and that's why we don't have as many problems as we have.
Oh no,
could have.
No, I completely agree with that. Whether it's a foreign threat or a domestic threat or whatever it is, it's if you believe in individual liberty. I mean, obviously, we live in a market economy, so we delegate, responsibilities, and we have specialization and division of labor, and that's all fine. But ultimately, you are responsible for your own safety. I mean, that's not something, and it's been, legally demonstrated before that the law enforcement does not have an obligation to protect you. They have an obligation to enforce the law. Right? The military does not have an obligation to protect the citizens. We have an obligation to follow lawful orders, support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, because there's no way you can make a government agency legally responsible for protecting you. You can make it a part of their purpose, but if you make them legally responsible for protecting you, well, then what happens when you get hurt? Can you take them to court and sue them because they weren't there, because the cop wasn't in your house when the burglar broke in? So I do think it comes back to, part of individual liberty is personal responsibility. And once you realize that you do bear some responsibility for your own safety, I don't think it's a constricting thing. I think it's a liberating thing.
Yeah.
So no, I agree.
You don't wait and back to my theme, you don't have to depend on some politician's empty promise.
Yeah.
And I really think, like, I was cruising around before we started talking about all the presidential candidates, and I suspect it's every single one of them, Republican, Democrat, God knows who else, that talk about how they're going to protect you. And they use it just to shoehorn whatever it is issue they want to talk about. They want to talk about gun control. They want to talk about sexual violence. They want to talk about immigration on the Republican side. And I think it's a lie. I don't think governments can keep us safe. I think that we keep ourselves safe.
No, I think. Now, obviously, I believe in a military. I believe in law enforcement and a court system. I think all of those things can contribute to a safe environment. They can also contribute to an oppressive environment.
Yeah.
It's a tool, and it's as good or as bad as the people that are occupying those positions. But I don't think individuals should ever surrender the right nor surrender the responsibility to recognize that they do have to defend themselves. Like I look at myself as, for my wife, for my kids, I have a responsibility to protect them. And that means physical protection. That's not just financial or emotional protection.
Yeah.
And more that term, I'm going to protect you, has spilled over not just into the physical protection, but it's the whole, we're going to protect you from every possible, challenge or difficulty that you could face in your life. And it really does, that sort of proposition does inevitably lead to greater, oppression. And I know that word, people think it's a little bit hyperbolic, but I'm sorry, how many lessons in history do we need to realize that once you have given the government this kind of authority, don't be surprised when they extend it way past beyond whatever you intended, and certainly beyond whatever they promised.
Well, think about your service in Iraq. I'm going to make you safer. We're going to invade Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction. What are we in our 19th year in Afghanistan now, where people that weren't even born at 9/11 are dying in Afghanistan, or at least putting their lives at risk. I'm going to make you safer by grabbing assault weapons, even all of the millions of legally acquired assault weapons. I'm going to make you safer by hacking your privacy and monitoring all your calls. Like the list is almost infinite. I'm going to make you safer by carpet bombing Syria. Whatever it is. And it's always in the context of that. And so I feel like we should at least be skeptical and say, well, let's dig a little bit deeper and figure out how that works. But it's not just that the Democrats and guns are hardly the only perpetrators here of this demagoguery. I feel like, we call them neocons, but, the so-called conservatives that have never seen a
Paul
war
Wolfowitz
they didn't like.
What was the joke that I think somebody said that Paul Wolfowitz goes home and plays Civilization 6 and just nukes innocent countries all day? Yeah. Well, again, I always go back to like on the foreign policy side. I'm not a pacifist. I do think there's times when military force is appropriate and necessary. But again, I think for too long in this country, we've just simply assumed that, well, when the executive branch decides it's time to go to war, I guess the patriotic thing to do is to go along with it. And I do believe in supporting our soldiers, but that's not a blank check to the government to deploy them all over the world fighting wars without any real clear objective or real clear definition of what victory looks like. And, again, a soldier swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I think it would be nice if the politicians that send them over there, under the guise that you're supporting and defending the Constitution, would also support the defending Constitution by actually going through the constitutional process before you deploy men and women overseas to fight. And so, yeah, I think that aspect, it's gotten way out of hand with how much power we do give the executive. I mean, yes, once we've declared war, the executive has constitutional authority to execute that war. But I think we should be a little bit more careful with what we're volunteering, our men and women to go over and fight. I remember there was this quote where George Bush, I think we were on year 3 or 4 in Iraq, where George Bush said, well, where's the Iraqi Thomas Jefferson? My response to that was, the French knew the answer to that question before they got involved in our revolution. So I think it's fair to say that, look, we need to, not only clearly determine that U.S. interest, valid U.S. interest in security is at risk if we don't get involved, but then we need to actually define what victory looks like so that we have a clear objective and so that our servicemen and women have a clear objective. And if they're not willing to follow the constitutional process to do that, if that's just way too cumbersome for them, then I'm sorry, it's not worth a single American life.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's too much to ask on our part.
I've noticed, and maybe you can corroborate this, but it seems like, certainly starting with Ron Paul, with his skepticism of permanent war, he had a lot of support amongst veteran and active people in service. It seems like Trump gets the same dynamic when it comes to getting out of Syria, getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, we haven't really executed those things yet, but he seems to get a lot of support from people in harm's way because they know what's actually going on and what the limits are of this kind of nation building stuff that we're doing.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's when you have to live at the business end of U.S. foreign policy, you want someone that A, actually knows what they're doing, and B, has your best interest in mind. And I think that I think Trump's built a lot of goodwill within the military community, one, by being supportive of the military, but by the same token, not spending their lives so cheaply as a lot of other presidents have done, as a lot of other executives has done. I was actually really surprised by some of his restraint with episodes that were happening with Iran and I mean, he threw a general out of the. I mean, it's reported he threw a general out of the Oval Office when they were asking for 30,000 more troops in Afghanistan. I think that he looks at this from a perspective of, I don't see what the compelling U.S. interest is in some of these, and I'm not willing to expend U.S. lives if you can't tell me what victory looks like. And so I think he has built a lot of goodwill, both on the support for the military on the one hand, but also the support from the end of, I'm not going to treat you like chess pieces.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, I remember when Ron Paul first started talking about foreign policy, man, I bristled. I didn't like it. I didn't like what he had to say about it. I thought he was way off base. And over time, I've become a lot more convinced, experience is a hard teacher, that a lot of what he was saying, and there's still areas where I would probably disagree with on finer points and whatnot, but on the larger point of, look, this idea that you're going to show up with some tanks and everyone's going to be like, oh, thank God, American liberators, gosh, how should we organize our country now? That doesn't happen. And we've seen that now.
Yeah.
And it is arrogant.
Well, you'll remember that our first president in his farewell address essentially said, slow down there, cowboy.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't say it quite that way, but he laid out some fairly reasonable questions that we should have when it comes to entangling alliances. Like, can we afford to do this?
Yeah.
Do we actually know that if we do this, we're going to get an outcome that's better than the status quo? And somewhere, I mean, I feel like even up to Ronald Reagan, the Republican Party was a party of restraint on foreign policy. Reagan himself was amazingly restrained when it came to, the Berlin Wall fell not because we blew it up, but because we practiced free enterprise. Radical idea today because, after 9/11, the Republican Party went sort of bonkers and decided that we could sort of reorganize the world order based on American ideals. Where is that sort of Thomas Jefferson guy kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, and you saw that first with Woodrow Wilson, and we're going to go make the world safe for democracy, and all we need is more international organizations to sit around and create policy. And then I do think Republicans, and I was guilty of that, immediately following 9/11, where when you get hit, you want to hit back. And I do think some hitting back was absolutely necessary after 9/11, but I think it's also fair to go back and question, okay, the hitting that we did, was it the cost-benefit analysis? Does this actually add up? Was this better for U.S. foreign policy? Or again, back to the emotional argument, or does it just make you feel better that you hit back?
Yeah.
And you hit back this hard, right? I'm not talking about don't hit hard, but hit hard where it actually has the impact and achieves the objective that we're looking for. And I think a lot of things with politics now have just become overwhelmingly emotionally driven. And again, the bad thing is not the emotion, but I go back to that statement. Emotion is an invitation to thought. Because if you really care, you're going to say, okay, I know how this makes me feel. And if I really care, I'm going to actually take the time to study and understand so that I can produce a good result, so that I can achieve the sort of a result that would be good and just and moral. But unfortunately now I think we're too often we want immediate gratification for whatever our action is. And we look at the action itself as, oh, well, at least we did something. Well, not if you screwed everything up or made it worse. I mean, that doesn't make you a good person.
None of the mass shooters in recent history in the United States were in any way sort of flagged by our enhanced surveillance and the sort of capturing all the data basically means that we don't see clear patterns amongst bad actors. So it actually has made us less safe while blowing the Fourth Amendment out of the water, while blowing personal privacy out of the water. And these are like core American values that we're just throwing out the window because someone said we'd be safer.
Well, and I think there's also an expectation that people have. And I'm going to paraphrase Tom Sowell, who's one of my I admire that guy so much. He's not allowed to die. That's my thing with Thomas Sowell. But he once said that once the electorate expects politicians to do things which are just not possible, then the only politicians will suffice are liars. Because they're the only ones willing to promise you the world for nothing in exchange.
Yeah.
And everything is ultimately on these policy decisions. It's not about solutions as much as it is about trade-offs. And for me, the freedom trade-off is I'm very, very skeptical of trading any of my freedom under the guise that some sort of new government agency or bureaucracy is going to make me safer or more prosperous or happier. But unfortunately, I think we have, just by the nature of the way we educate people or we talk about politics, both sides of the aisle, is it's always this idea of, okay, oh my gosh, here's a problem. What's government going to do about it? Well, when my car breaks down, I don't immediately think to myself, gosh, what's my dentist going to do about this? Because my dentist isn't trained to fix my car. My dentist isn't suited to fix my car. No matter how good intentioned my dentist might be, that's not my dentist's skill set. So if I take my broken car to the dentist and say, fix this for me, and he fails to do so, the logical response would not to be, well, gosh, my dentist doesn't care enough. I need to find someone who really... No, government is set up to solve certain problems. And when it stays within those narrow lanes of protecting individual liberty, protecting property rights, protecting from foreign invasion, and it otherwise allows free people to work in voluntary cooperation to solve problems, then I think it can be of use. But we've created this atmosphere now to where if you're the politician that is willing to tell someone, well, that's not an appropriate role of government, well, then you don't care enough.
Yeah.
Or I care enough to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
So what would you rather have?
It's a tough message to deliver, particularly when emotions and tribalism are sort of defining everything we talk about.
Yeah.
Not only is it hard to talk about the reason and the proper role of limited government, and there are very good reasons why the founders did it this way, but frankly it's hard to talk about policy.
Yeah.
We don't talk about policy anymore. We spend all of our time talking about how bad the other side is.
Yeah.
Whatever you think of me, just keep in mind those guys are worse. And that's the entire. And both parties, I think, make this is their primary argument.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And it is unfortunate. I had a group full of high school students ask me once, like, how do we get civility back in politics? Like, well, the first mistake is thinking it was ever there, but okay, how do we get to a more civil political discussion?
Yeah.
I said, well, first things first, tone matters, right? There's a number of ways I can ask you a question or I can talk to you about something, and if I use the right tone, you'll probably be willing to at least hear me out. So tone matters.
Yeah.
The second one is try not to assume people's intentions unless they've really given you a good indication that they have bad ones. Then don't assume they have bad ones. Assume they have good intentions, but maybe you disagree with the policy. I said those two right off the bat can get you a lot farther than most people get in political discourse these days. I said, but here's the third issue, and this is the one where it does become more philosophical. If I have a nice tone, and I don't assume you have negative content or intentions, but ultimately my goal is to force you to do something you don't want to do, you're still going to bristle at that. And that's the problem with trying to solve so many things through government.
You're going to fight.
Is that ultimately I'm not having a nice discussion with you about what policy I prefer. I'm having a nice discussion with you about what policy I'm about to impose on you against your will, and you don't get to do anything about it. I'm sorry, that's at some point civility is going to break down. Now, if we were talking about feeding hungry people, and you had a particular way to do it, and I had a particular way to do it, and neither of them relied on coercive force. We could either, I could say, you know what, your idea is better, let's do that. Or we could say, you know what, I don't like your idea, you don't like mine, so we're going to go off and we're going to both try our respective ideas, and we're going to see which one works best. You can coexist in both of those environments because neither of us are trying to force the other one to do something. But the moment you say, here's my idea, and I think it's really great, and I really think you should like it too. Oh, by the way, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to use the government to forcefully confiscate your wealth and redistribute it in accordance with the way I think it should be done. That doesn't sound very civil to me.
No.
So that was the other component that I'm trying to get across to these kids is that, one, if you want genuine civility, stop trying to force people to do things that you want them to. And two, recognize that you have the power within yourself. You don't need to ask permission from the government or a politician to go feed a hungry person or help a homeless person or whatever it is. To solve a problem, you can start a business, you can come up with a charity, you can do all of these things that are there for you to go do it. No permission necessary. So why don't we try that first? Can we at least, here's an idea. What if we try the peaceful solutions first? And once we've exhausted those, then we can start to talk about your coercive and violent solutions to problems.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable, request, if you really want civility in politics, but unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I think you've pinpointed the solution and also the problem of getting at that solution. I mean, I'll butcher another George Washington quote because he basically said that government is not civil, it's violence. Mm-hmm. And he said something else, but it meant the same thing. And the only way to expand civility is to shrink the power of government so that guy that really wants to force you to live a certain way.
Yeah.
And again, this is I really think both parties are guilty of this to a great extent today. I'm going to take charge of government so that I can force those other guys to get in line on this.
Well, it's, you bring up Young Americans for Liberty, and I love going to YALCONs because one of the great things about YALCON is, so I'm a devout heterosexual Christian male, right?
So fairly exotic.
Yeah, fairly
profile,
exotic in the United States, right? But you go to YALCON and you'll see somebody that is maybe transgender or an atheist or whatever it is. And we all sit together and we have a beer and we talk about a variety of ideas, and we're all friends. We have drastically different worldviews on core fundamental issues.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're talking about an atheist and a Christian, I mean, we disagree on the fundamentals of life.
Yeah.
And yet here we are getting along just fine, talking to each other at Yalcon. Why? Because we know neither of us is going to try to use force against the other one. So we have the ability to engage in a free exchange of ideas. And where we agree, we work together. And when we don't agree, we try different things. And the proof is in the results, not your ability to force someone to do what you want. And that's the beauty of it. I mean, if you really want coexistence, again, coexistence is resisting the urge to coerce people that you can't convince. And it's amazing that how much friendlier an environment we have when we're not all trying to find some politician to impose our will on our neighbor.
I'm going to leave it right there. That was awesome. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.